think of as many science fiction films as you can. Go. So maybe you imagine some of these. You probably saw some spaceships, aliens, some artificial intelligence, some dystopian worlds, time travel, and so on. And the reason why it's not very difficult to come up with visuals from science fiction is because the genre has this way of kind of rooting itself in our cultural imaginary. Tonight, however, these are the ones I won't be talking about, because I will talk about the missing voices in science fiction, and specifically in science fiction cinema, and some of the imaginaries that we usually don't get to see, and are therefore also very difficult to imagine. Because science fiction is actually one of the least diverse genres in cinema. And while there have recently been attempts to make the genre more inclusive and diverse, like in this background same-sex kiss in Star Wars in the latest film, and most of you probably missed it because basically if you blinked your eye, like it was gone. Many of the interventions come down to the inclusion of characters from a range of marginalized groups, but they usually leave intact this dominant narrative of the often white male protagonist on his, epic hero journey. So tonight I will show you a few visions of futures and worlds that differ radically from these often white, heteronormative, and progress kind of centered narratives in science fiction film. I refer to these as alternative futurisms. And with alternative futurisms, I mean these visions of the future that critique and subvert dominant imaginaries that we all know. And they're often made by and for marginalized groups who have been historically not given a future at all. So in this lecture, I will shortly introduce you to Afrofuturism, that some of you might have already heard of, indigenous futurisms, and queer futurisms. So let's turn to the first one, and you're probably all familiar with this one, which is Black Panther from 2018 by Ryan Coogler. And it's a science fiction blockbuster with Afrofuturist elements. And Afrofuturism is a cultural aesthetic, and you can find it in a range of artistic forms like visual arts, literature, music with Beyonce, Solange, and also in film. So it reimagines the history of the African diaspora and creates alternative futures through a Black lens, often with a focus on technology. And in Black Panther, we see it visualized in Wakanda, the fictional African country that is the world's most technologically advanced society. And it obviously proposes a very different image to the one that we're used to of this poverty-stricken Africa. And in Wakanda, technology goes hand in hand with tradition, as we can see, for example, in its architecture and in its fashion. And it shows the importance of this kind of entanglement of history and tradition in Afrofuturist practices. And history in Wakanda, by visualizing Wakanda, is also rewritten, because Wakanda avoided colonization because it had these, advanced technologies. And the existence of this fictional world allows for the imagining of a Black society that was able to evolve without the interruption of colonization, and visualizes a future for those that were for a very long time rendered without a future altogether. So Black Panther was a huge box office success, and surprisingly so, perhaps, also among indigenous populations, especially in the US and in Canada. And one of the main reasons for this is that mainstream cinema does not offer any indigenous futures. And they've only recently started to receive more attention, and they fulfill the task of countering the stereotypical representations of indigenous people that seem to belong only to the past. And although mainstream film does exist very much in literature, like I said, like mainstream film doesn't touch this, but also in independent film, we have a lot of examples of this. And an example is The Sixth World by Nadobe Becker from 2012, which you can view on YouTube. And it shows a future in which the Navajo Nation co-funds the first space mission to Mars to create a new world for people from Earth. And GMO corn, so genetically manipulated corn, plays a very important part in supplying oxygen and food in this new world. But when the GMO corn fails, because it starts to rot, the protagonist, which is a female DNA astronaut, uses native corn that was smuggled aboard, and which has traditionally been used for protection and healing, to save the day. So the sixth world, first of all, proposes this world in which the Navajo Nation is an important player in world politics and space exploration. And it also presents, like Black Panther, a world in which tradition and technology come together. And in this instant, ancient indigenous knowledge of plants and agriculture, and it meets with Western science to create new technologies. So in the short film and in other indigenous futurist narratives, the emphasis is very much on relationships and the connection to community and the sharing of land and technology instead of the colonial tropes that we're so familiar with from space exploration films. So both Afrofuturism and indigenous futurisms, they present these different ways of dealing with time. So they alter the linear connection between the past, the present, and the future. And this resonates very much with non-linear queer temporality, which is a characteristic of queer futurisms. So queer time breaks with straight and narrow paths towards the future, which are laid out for the reproductive family, for the law-abiding citizen, for the believer in markets. And queer futurity means the imagining of worlds in which these straight lines are abandoned. Identity is no longer put in the same restrictive boxes as we do today. And interestingly, and perhaps expectedly so, of course, again, when we look beyond the inclusion of LGBTQ+ characters or themes of sexual and reproductive politics in sci-fi films, there's no examples. Surprise, surprise again. But when I started digging around to see what I could find in kind of mainstream cinema that would exemplify this, I came across Alex Garland's Annihilation from 2018. Some of you may have seen it. It's on Netflix. So we can look at this and get an idea of what a queer future might look like, even though it's probably not where you're expecting. So in the film, an alien event referred to only as the Shimmer descends upon a portion of the United States. And when an all-female team of scientists enters the Shimmer, so this is already, you know, like, what? An all-female team of scientists? Because all the males that went in before completely failed, of course. The alien functions as a prism. So it diffracts light and time, which passes completely differently within the prism. And it also diffracts DNA of humans and plants and animals and creates these crazy hybrids, mutations, and duplicates of life forms. And what it does, and it shows a world in which the biological basis for everything that we take, you know, for what it means to be human is made completely unreliable. And it allows us a vision of a post-human world characterized by change and hybridity, where binaries such as nature, culture, past and present, and male and female become completely irrelevant. And they resist dominant ideas about progress, time, and gender. So the lack of alternative futurisms in film shows the biases of traditional mainstream science fiction. And apparently, it seems to be impossible to imagine futures that are truly deviant from the ideologies of the present. So while science fiction is able to imagine, you know, the most outrageous technologies and planets and aliens and fashion, the fictional societies were and still are predominantly based on existing political and economic structures and dominant ideas about gender, race, and class relations. So in many ways, science fiction is not really about predicting the future, but it's very much a reflection of the present. And it can also be harnessed to show significant distortions of the present and demonstrate that the future does not need to be closed down in these familiar paths. And to avoid reproducing the inequalities that we see in the world today, it's very important that we assure that the processes that kind of write the future today, like science fiction, are not tainted by these same inequalities. So achieve this, we have to allow for more alternative futurisms, these new stories to be told, so that we can engage with radically different worlds that can let us experience what other ways of being might feel like. Thank you.